But it seems to me, at least in terms of how I present this teaching, it's based fundamentally on two different things, which are really the same. One would be meditation, which, as I see it, is actually the art of allowing everything to be exactly as it is. And when I say that, I often remind people, and that's not a directive. That doesn't mean you are now supposed to try to allow everything to be as it is, because the thing that would try to do that is the very thing that has no vested interest whatsoever in allowing anything to be as it is for very long. See? So it's not a directive. It's not a technique. Now this is what I'm going to try to do. It's more like a question. What is it? Or what happens when I allow everything to be? You see, it's totally different than saying, now what you're to do is to allow everything to be as it is. See? Because then you're trying to do it, which is a total contradiction. But if it's a question, what would it be like to allow this thought to be exactly as it is? Yes, but my mind's active. It's really busy tonight. What would it be to totally allow it to be the way it is? Yes, but maybe nothing would change. What would it be like to allow absolutely nothing to change right now? This minute. You see, then the question then elicits the deeper reality. It's not the meditator trying to make something happen. You're actually eliciting something. Because of course, that if reality is real, that means it has to be present. Reality can't at once be real and at the same time not be present. If it's not present anywhere, then it's not the reality of wherever you happen to be. So the reality, which is really all enlightenment really means, seeing things the way they actually are, instead of seeing things the way they aren't. And so, to me, this is where the question, it's not a particular question necessarily, although I think since most people are completely obsessed with themselves, which I don't say that in any critical way, because in the egoic state of consciousness, that's literally the only thing available to us, including if we're trying not to be obsessed with ourselves. It's its own obsession. Does that make sense? Have you ever tried to be really selfless? It's impossible. Like it says in the good book, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm really glad that it doesn't say love your neighbor like yourself, because I don't want anybody loving me the way they love themselves, because most people love themselves in a pretty conflicted, awful way, if the truth be told. But to love your neighbor as yourself, now there's a Zen koan if there ever was one. What could that mean? What would it be to love my neighbor as myself? That's one of those sayings that's very prominent in Western culture because it comes from one of our Western tradition. But it's one of those things that we've heard about. Most of us have heard something that said, and we've heard it so much that we don't actually realize how tremendously pointed and demanding that is. And how the only possible way to love something or someone as yourself is to see them quite literally, not figuratively, but quite literally as yourself. It's the only way to do it. Anything else is just egoic spiritual play. So it seems to me that at a certain point in our spirit and our maturity, because really it's all this is just how far we mature. It's not about better or worse or good or bad. It's about just our state of maturity. At a certain state of maturity, we will find ourselves inextricably asking the existential questions of life. Until we're ready for that, we won't be interested in them. We won't care who we are. The meaning of our life, we might care a little bit, but not really. We'd care more about, buying the latest fashion or something than existential question, But at a certain state of maturity, just naturally the existential questions of one's existence just start to come into consciousness. They bubble up. And they disturb the sleeping mind. And they start to make you feel something that the Buddha talked about. He had a very fundamental insight into the nature of life as most people live it. And what he saw is life as most people live it is inherently unsatisfactory. Doesn't mean there's not good times, or you can't laugh, or you don't experience joy, or love, or compassion. It just means even though you experience all those things, at the end of the day, there's a certain unsatisfactoriness of it. Does that make sense? In every religion you come upon this. In the Western religions, I think in a way that doesn't always serve us really well, we projected this onto a very big stage. And instead of saying life is unsatisfactory, inherently unsatisfactory, we grow up and we feel like, okay, it's like you get born into the world and someone says to you, welcome to the world, and by the way, your very existence is a sin. Right? And it's some guy's named Adam's fault, and you're all paying for it. And sorry. You're lucky if you get the sorry point. But that story is actually encapsulating a very similar truth. It's told in a different way. It has a different metaphor. But it's communicating something that is universal to the human experience, which is this universal sense, every religion, every form of spirituality, every philosophy, they recognize it, this sense, this feeling, this intuition, it's as if something's not quite right. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's me, maybe it's you, maybe it's us, maybe it's the world, maybe the devil made me do it. I don't know what it is, but something's not quite right. Anybody ever feel that way? In the Western culture, we've inverted that. In Western culture. So in Western culture, what people in the Western culture are afflicted with is there's something fundamentally, essentially wrong with me. I fundamentally feel a lack, some sort of lack. I'm not quite good enough. I never fully measure up. This sense of, what do they call it? One of the symptoms of it is having bad self-esteem. Does that make sense? One of the other symptoms is having fantastic self-esteem. They're both the same thing, actually. You just want to experience the illusion from a positive or negative side, But we invert that. We've taken that inside. Some of you have probably heard the story. It's an old story because it happened probably 35 years ago, of a Tibetan Lama, a very famous Tibetan Lama that came to the United States. And he initially started teaching, and when he started to see his Western students in private, he recounted in his story the first time that one of his students told him that they didn't feel good about themselves. And this Lama, he had nothing in his experience that was a reference to understand what the person was talking about. He literally didn't know what it meant. He said in his culture, nobody has the problem. It's not part of the cultural discussion that I walk around feeling like there's somehow something not right with me. And one of his questions is, how could you not like yourself? There was just nothing in the experience to say, how could you not like yourself, right? So I'm sure his culture had its own hang-ups, or I imagine that it has its own hang-ups that are a little bit different. As I say, in the West, we totally invert this. There's something wrong with me. But then we do the favor of then we put it back out. Now there's something wrong with you. The favor is always returned eventually. And of course then it also gets into our whole spiritual search. Sometimes our search is a search for a healing of there's something wrong with me. I don't feel quite worthy. Everywhere around us in our culture, what's reinforced is if you just wear this, if you just take this, if you just eat this, if you just appear like this, then you'll feel better about yourself, you'll be a better person, you'll be more worthy. If you can just accomplish this. Of course, in our American culture, our gods are no longer spiritual. They're celebrities. So in our culture now, I'll be happy when I get famous. If you have any doubt, look at what people watch on TV. These pitiful, sorry reality shows. Where really just people want to be famous, and it's often people in pain wanting to be famous. So that's a whole other story. Nonetheless, it gets into one's spirituality, and before you know it, you're trying to heal something which in its own domain is relevant, it makes sense. But as the Buddha said 2,600 years ago, basically when he said life is unsatisfactory, he was tapping into this. There's an underlying thing. Not only because there's sickness, old age, and death, which there is sickness, old age, and death. That's part of life. But one of the burdens I think most people suffer under is they're continually trying to prove themselves to themselves, or to others, or to get enough love or approval, or to be a wonderful, good person, be a spiritual person. There's lots of different ways that this plays itself out. This unsatisfactoriness. I think it's useful to understand that it's universal. So in that sense, it's nothing personal. It feels personal, but there's nothing personal about it. It's part and parcel of a particular state of consciousness. Whatever you want to call that state, it's the common state of human consciousness. And within that state of consciousness, there is a sense of unsatisfactoriness. And there's no way around it. The most you can hope for if you stay in that state of consciousness is to mitigate the unsatisfactoriness. Or as I say, you learn how to dream better. If you're going to have a living dream, it's better if you know how to dream well than not so good. So most people don't know how to dream particularly well, which means they don't know really how to be in a satisfying relationship, or be in a job they like for a long time, or feel relatively good about themselves and their existence. And there are, of course, plenty of people who can do all these, but the people who can function in those ways, they've learned how to dream well for most part. And most of the others are people that, from varying degrees, they don't know how to dream well. They're constantly reminded of some sort of dysfunction, inadequacy. But even if you can dream well, as the Buddha realized, still, even then, if you got plenty of money, 2.5 kids, picket fence, nice house, you don't have to worry about money, your family works pretty good, got your kids through college, they found you got grandkids, whatever your version is, even if you've got your version, or you find your soulmate, whatever a soulmate is, eventually you realize there's still unsatisfactoriness. That was his insight. Most people never get it so together that they realize that even when they have everything together, there's still some amount of unsatisfactoriness. But the people who do, or they achieve a lot, if those people who achieve things in our society where we say, they've risen to the top, they're the happy ones. Often those people have, at some point, faced very difficult times. That's why I often feel very sorry for people of like great celebrity, because the culture goes, you've made it, you're on the screen, we watch you, you make millions of dollars, people love you wherever you go. It's lovely, and if you ever succeed like that, or in whatever your sphere of total success is, and the day that it dawns on you, and it's not enough. That's a tough day. And it's not enough. At that moment, you too realized what the Buddha did. At that moment, you too have tapped into the fundamental insight, one of them that the Buddha had. I mean, so far this sounds like bad news. This isn't a...